So many yoga teachers who teach private lessons are failing their clients. What are your clients' goals? What are they trying to achieve? How are you going to achieve that? And how are you going to see if what you're having them do is actually creating results that you want to see and that, more importantly, your client wants to see? Let's check out outcome measures in today's episode. Real quick, I'm Anthony Davis. This is Shapeshift Wellness. We explore the science of fitness, yoga, and meditation. If you like that sort of thing, subscribe. If you want more, go to my website. Now let's learn about outcome measures. Now the term outcome measures comes from the clinical world. Remember, I am a clinical intern at the moment and soon to be a doctor. So a lot of what I'm helping to educate on is going to come from a clinical world. But there's so much in the clinical world that I think that yoga teachers and personal trainers, especially who work with one-on-one clientele, really could benefit from learning. Now, what an outcome measure is, well, it's anything that you measure. It's anything that you can actually track that shows you that you're making some kind of progress, or maybe the opposite is happening and people are getting worse over time. Now, in healthcare, that's usually something like pain or disability, or if you were in mental health, then it would be things like anxiety, depression. These kinds of things are outcome measures, and we can measure them with standard actual questionnaires and devices that can measure them, whatever. You're not going to use those if you're a yoga teacher, but there are some really standard outcome measures that we use in the clinical world that can be used in the training world as well, and we'll get to those in a moment. But the fact is that just because I'm calling it an outcome measure does not mean that it has to be clinical. All I mean by an outcome measure is a measure of your outcomes, a way to track progress to make sure you know that you're actually getting results. Let's check it out. So why would you use outcome measures? I think in the yoga world, a lot of times we want to just feel our way through our practices, and that can be tremendously beneficial. And perhaps you choose to do that most of the time. But I'm telling you, if you teach private clientele, if you're not measuring something, you are guessing. So don't guess, assess. Learn your client's goals. You want to know, what are they after? What are they trying to achieve? Are they trying to achieve more flexibility? Are they trying to get strong? Are they trying to get in shape? Are they trying to just feel better? Are they trying to feel happier? Are they trying to feel more confident? Whatever, I don't care. Are they trying to feel more peaceful? Great. Find something, establish their goals. And then once you do, we want to test their current ability. Where are they at right now? Let's get a baseline. And then you come up with some kind of training for them that you think is going to help them get results. That's what we're after here. That's why we're using outcome measures. So then you train their weaknesses. Now, you don't know what their weaknesses are unless you test them in a measurable way. And then after you do all this, you will want to retest, and this is how you use outcome measures, to see if your training actually did anything. Hey, by the way, at the end of the video, I'm going to give you a really simple mantra that you can use, just a good rule of thumb that you can use to apply outcome measures to your training and exercise, and really anything that you're trying to do when you're trying to get results, whether that's in physical fitness or mindfulness practices or your health in general. So let's keep going here. So what are some examples of some outcome measures? Well, I've named a few standard assessments that we perform in the personal training world. And this is one of my big gripes with yoga teacher trainings, is that not only do you fail to learn about the anatomy, which is, can be detrimental for I think obvious reasons, but more importantly is that even if you do have a good training that teaches you, how the joints work and how they move and how the muscles work and all these great anatomy principles, if you don't understand physiology and exercise science, then you don't understand how to actually apply the anatomy. The anatomy is, by definition, anatomy is just gross anatomy. It's just what connects to where and generally what is its function. But that doesn't tell you how to apply that to real people. And so textbooks on personal training, on strength and conditioning and exercise science, every time you read one of those, they always start, or at least they contain assessments, standard assessments that you should be doing with yourself if you're just training yourself, or your clientele if you happen to work with people one-on-one. So here are some standard outcome measures. Endurance. How long can you hold a pose? Strength. What's the most difficult thing that you can do one time? Range of motion. How far can you move your joints? Balance. How long can you steady yourself when in an unsteady environment? Heart rate. How does your heart and your vascular system handle exercise? And etc. Meaning there are a lot of different types of outcome measures, and some of them are not standardized, and you can be creative, and we'll kind of explore that at the end. Hey, I'd even love you to right now drop a comment. What would you think would be worth measuring if you're not a yoga teacher? What do you think, if you're trying to get your goals met, what could you measure in order to test your progress? Or if you're a teacher, what do you think that you can measure for your clients? Leave it in the comments below. Other than the things that I've named here, get creative. Maybe something about breathing, maybe something about mindfulness, maybe something about attention. I don't know. What do you think? What could you measure to track that somebody is actually making progress in their practice? So let's take a deeper look at each of the outcomes that I pointed out. So first is endurance. Now, endurance is classically measured with duration tests. So tests of how long can you hold a plank? How long can you hold, we could get creative here with yoga and say, how long can you hold Warrior Two? Maybe that's their problem point. I feel really great with most of the yoga poses, but I really, downward facing dog. I do not feel strong in downward facing dog. Okay, well, let's do this. Let's make a test out of it. Let's make an endurance test, because you should always test endurance before you test strength, because endurance is easier and safer. Strength is typically harder and comes with a heavier risk when you assess it. So endurance, okay, so how long can you hold a downward facing dog without cheating or without coming out of the pose, right? And you can give a person 3 warnings, for example, before you call the test and stop the timer. So you can test them and get a baseline. Oh, you can hold downward facing dog for 15 seconds before you come out of it. Okay, I think we can do better. Let's do a bunch of training and then come back to this in a month and see how you do. Another way that you can measure endurance is the max number of repetitions within a minute. So if you're trying to, let's say somebody's doing pretty strong, they're pretty strong, and you want to test their endurance with chaturangas. You could do you could have them do how many chaturanga to up dog to down dog. How many of those little vinyasa flows could you do in 1 minute? That would be a creative test. It's not a standardized test. It's not like validated, but it is if you do it the same way every time with your clients or with yourself, if you're trying to measure your own progress, then it would be reliable for you, and that would be fine. And then there are a lot of endurance tests that aren't really yoga, they don't really apply to yoga, like how quickly can you walk or run 1 mile, for example. And that would be an endurance test, but it is not really yoga, because it's walking and running. But it's a really good way to test your endurance. So maybe if you have a yoga client, maybe you work in some non-yoga assessments, because if you see how quickly they can walk or run a mile, then you could actually test, hey, actually this would be really interesting. Think about this. This would be really cool, because typically we don't think about yoga as improving cardiovascular fitness, and generally it doesn't. But if you wanted to test that theory, maybe a good way of testing that is, okay, work with somebody, they only do yoga. They don't do any running. They don't do any walking. They don't do any of that. Start them off at the beginning of the training, test how quickly they can walk or run a mile. Then go train yoga for 8 weeks and don't do any other training, no walking, no running, no cardio work, and then retest their mile time. And if it improves, then shit, I guess yoga did improve their cardiovascular fitness. You see why we're using outcomes is because you can see if you're making a difference. Next up is strength. Strength, classically, we would measure with a 1 repetition maximum lift, and that would be the heaviest weight that you could possibly pick up. Now in yoga, this is really difficult to test because we're not using weight, we're just using body weight. The only way that you can really test strength in yoga is if somebody starts from a baseline of not really being very strong. Because strength, and please watch my videos explaining strength, because those videos tell you really what the definition of strength is and how yoga doesn't actually make you strong. Yoga improves muscular endurance very well. It improves balance very well, but it does not improve strength unless you started with your baseline strength being very, very poor and you being very deconditioned. In which case you could say, okay, this person cannot perform even one single chaturanga. Okay, so therefore, if they could perform a single chaturanga, that would be their 1 rep max for a chaturanga. So that would legitimately be a measure of strength. So if they start from a baseline of, I can't do a chaturanga, then we work on wall push-ups, wall chaturangas. Then we do incline chaturangas. Then we do knees down chaturangas. And we do that as training. And then we come back to it and say, now can you do a chaturanga? And then we test it and they can do 1 chaturanga. Or we test them and we say, what's the hardest variation of a chaturanga that you can do? Okay, you can do the wall ones easily, you can do the incline ones easily, but you cannot do the knees down chaturangas. You can't even do one of those. So then we go train the other ones and come back and we say, now what's the hardest variation you can do? And now the knees down ones are easier and they can in fact do 1 normal chaturanga. So we can say strength in terms of what is the most difficult variation of the pose. Now caveat here, because the most difficult variation of a pose, oftentimes in order to make it more difficult, we take limbs off the floor. So if doing a chaturanga was too easy, then I could lift an arm off and do a 1-arm chaturanga, for example, or I could take a leg off or 2 legs off and be doing a crow and do kind of like an arm balance push-up. So that's now, is that actually a measure of strength or is that a measure of balance because you're arm balancing? Well, it's kind of a measure of both, so it's not truly measuring strength. So just be careful of what you think you're measuring versus what you're actually measuring, because in yoga, strength is really, really hard to measure. One last caveat, one last little note here, a handheld dynamometer. These things are really cool. You can hold them in the palm of your hand and you have somebody push against you as hard as they possibly can. And that's a 1 rep max, basically, an isometric 1 rep max. And that's a way of measuring their absolute maximum strength in a measurable way, right? And unfortunately, those devices are very expensive. But if you're really, really like geeky about this kind of stuff and you really want to be precise and say, no. Not only do I want to measure strength, I want to measure specific strength while their leg is in this exact angle. I want to measure your strength in a position specific task, which would be very hard to measure without a handheld dynamometer. These things are very cool. Just food for thought. Again, they're very expensive though. So next, range of motion. So range of motion is your flexibility. How far can your joints and muscles move? How much is your body willing to accommodate motion? And there are a few ways that we can measure this. We can measure this with a goniometer, which is pictured right here. So this device basically just has a wheel here with different degrees. So we can say how many degrees of knee extension or knee flexion you have or whatever. So we can measure joint angles with the goniometer. An inclinometer is good. It's basically like a little device that has a little bubble in it, and you place it on a limb, and then you measure as they go to the side, and that bubble will shift positions and show you how many degrees of range of motion you just moved that limb, basically. So an inclinometer is a quick way to get a precise measurement of a person's range of motion. And then I just said active versus passive because when you're measuring range of motion in functional range assessment, which comes from from functional range conditioning and all those guys. So we would typically measure both active and passive range of motion because that tells us something unique about that person. Like if they have too low of active but really good passive and there's a gap, or if it's actually within 85% or whatever. My point is, you don't necessarily just want to measure one thing, but it's up to you and your goals and your client's goals as to what you actually measure. Next up, balance. Balance is, well, your ability to be balanced, to hold yourself upright. Tree pose is a good example here. So ways of measure it, typically we time them. We say, how long can you hold this balance pose before you have to put a foot down? So we could do a single leg balance, right? That would be a simple way. Then we could, if that's too easy, we can have them close the eyes, and that would be a single leg balance test with the eyes closed. And there are other ways that you could test a person's balance, right? You could test balance in an arm balance, like a crow pose or something like that as well. But then you're kind of measuring muscular endurance as well. It's tricky, right? How do you measure the vestibular system? And your proprioception, but not muscular endurance. That's why the single leg balance test with your eyes closed is a good test, because it doesn't require a lot of strength. It really relies on your vestibular system and your feedback from your ankle to your brain, basically. Makes sense? So we can also come up with, in yoga, we could say, well, what are maybe some pose-specific tests? So there's one I like to do where you do a lunge and you look at your thumb and then you move into a twist and you watch your thumb the whole time. And by virtue, I'm not going to explain the neurology, but basically by virtue of watching your thumb the whole time, it messes with your balance. So that's a good test. And if people are really wobbly, then we could go do some training, come back to it in a couple months and see if they improved their ability to do that, right? And you can come up with other specific progressions. Heart rate. Now, what I should have said was cardiovascular endurance, but heart rate would be the one way to measure that. And typically in a personal training setting, we would use a YMCA 3-minute step test. And there are many different, I think there's like a Queen's step test, and there are a bunch of different step tests, whatever. Just use the same one every single time and make sure that it's a validated step test. So you can use this to estimate a person's VO2 max, which is a really, really important measure of cardiovascular fitness. Some people call it an additional vital sign. It's so important. So my point is, in yoga, we typically don't look at a person's cardiovascular fitness. And frankly, it's because yoga is not very good at improving a person's cardiovascular fitness. But if you're not measuring this, then it probably means you're not doing anything about it. But if you're not focusing on this, you're missing a really, really important aspect of physical fitness and health for your clients or for yourself. So again, if somebody's just doing yoga, I really, really strongly recommend that you add some kind of cardio into their programming, right? Even if that's just, hey, 5 days a week, I want you to go on a 30-minute walk. Cool, done, good enough. We're done. That's perfect, right? Oh, they like riding a bike? Great, have them just do that. Forget about it. It doesn't have to be in their yoga practice. You can do yoga and you can go for hikes on a regular basis. You can do yoga and like riding a bike, whatever it is. And then you could come up with task-specific ways of measuring the heart rate. So maybe somebody, when they're doing vinyasas, their heart rate gets really high and they feel really tired. Well, maybe you can get creative and say, okay, let's do 5 chaturangas, vinyasas. Let's do 5 sun salutations, sunes. And I'm coming up with this off the top of my head. And then, okay, now let's measure your heart rate by just pulling up hopefully they have an Apple Watch. That's the quickest way to grab a quick heart rate, or some kind of Fitbit or whatever. And then boom, take your heart rate. And then otherwise you got to get really good at taking people's heart rates quickly and see what they got after 5 chaturangas or 5 sun salutations or 10 of them, whatever. And then you go do some training and come back to it. Make sense? And then maybe their cardiovascular system is now better able to handle those sun salutations. And then that means that whatever you're doing is working. Hey, a quick note, as we talk about these outcome assessments, I really just want to make sure you don't get obsessed with the assessment, okay? Because this is not your training. This is not, this is not your exercise. This is a way to establish goals, test where you're at, and inform what you're going to do in the future in order to improve them and make sure you're making progress. So don't get obsessed with the outcomes. Don't throw too many outcomes. You don't need to do an endurance test for Warrior 2 and an endurance test for Chaturangas and an endurance test for plank and an endurance, did I say that? And an endurance test for a side plank and an endurance test for, oh my God, just pick one. Pick the most important one for that person. So if that person really struggles with a side plank, but their normal plank is fine, just do the side plank. That's it. In this case, less is more, but we do want to make sure we cover all of our bases based on a person's goals. Make sense? Now let's just quickly jump back to this slide to say, etc., meaning you can come up with your own tests. So leave in the comments, what else could you test to measure progress in a yoga setting? Because we have all these assessments for personal training, but let's admit that yoga typically, even when we are focused on physical health and physical conditioning, we tend to have a different mindset about it than we do in the gym. And so you might want to measure different things. So here's one idea, and I want you to come up with, I don't want to give you too many ideas. I want you to come up with ideas and leave them in the comments. So here's one idea. Maybe we're working on calm breathing during yoga poses. So we come up with a standard sequence. So we come up with a basic standing set of poses. And that's our test. So we do the test, and then we measure how long can your breaths be in this sequence. And we hold the poses for a set amount of time or whatever. And we just say, okay, we start off and your breaths, an inhale and an exhale for you lasts, 5 seconds, okay? I want to see if you can breathe in for 4 and out for 6. That's our target. That's our goal. That's where we want to get to. But right now, your inhale is like 2 seconds, your exhale is 3 seconds. Well, let's see if we can really hone in on breathing during a our yoga training sessions together. And then over time, we come back to it and we retest this and we say, or you just noticed during your training because you did the baseline assessment. And so your reassessment doesn't have to be like a big, oh, hoorah, now we're doing the reassessment. It's just, you just know because you're teaching them and you're doing this yourself and you noticed yourself and you time it. You're like, oh, wait a minute. 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh, I'm actually really competent at breathing very slowly. That's pretty interesting. So maybe that's one thing that you could test. But leave in the comments, what are your suggestions? What do you think you could track in yoga that's specific maybe to yoga that you wouldn't necessarily track in a personal training kind of gym setting? I'd really love to hear your suggestion. And finally, here's your mantra. This is your recap. If you remember nothing else, just remember this. The reason I bring up outcome measures in the first place is because we need to know if we're making progress. We need to know if we're getting results in our training. Is what we're doing actually doing anything for us? Is it making us stronger? Is it making us more mindful? Is it helping me to be a better person outside of yoga? Hint, hint, maybe there's some outcome measures that are yoga specific. So here's your mantra. Test whatever you want based on that person's goals. Then train based on what you tested. And then retest. So here's your mantra: test, train, retest. If you don't do that, you don't know if what you're doing is working. You don't know if you're getting results. And if you do this, then more importantly, if you're not getting those results, and if you need to change something so that you can get results. It will make you better as a yoga teacher. Your clients will get better results. It will make you look better. It will make them feel better. Everybody knows that you're really doing the best thing for that individual. This test, train, retest is actually ripped off of a clinical mantra that we use in clinic all the time, which is test, treat, retest, where we test somebody's pain, we treat them, and we retest. Is your pain less? Is your range of motion better? If no, then we need to do something else. If yes, we know we're doing the right thing. So this is, again, borrowed from a clinical setting, but if you apply this to a personal training or yoga or a private lesson setting, this is perfect. Test, train, retest, and you will know you're getting results. That's it. I really appreciate you watching. Again, leave your suggestions in the comments for outcome measures. Really curious to see that, and I'll see you in the next episode. Like and subscribe. It helps me out, and likes are free. Peace.